He's still breathing. The words hung in the cold stone chamber like a prayer no one dared speak aloud. Father Dimitri's trembling hand hovered above the mahogany coffin, his fingers tracing the carved cross as if touch alone could resurrect what lay beneath the silk. Outside, Vienna wept in November rain, a city that had learned to mourn in silence, to bury its secrets alongside its dead. Katarina Volkova was not supposed to survive. The consumption that hollowed her cheeks, that turned her skin to porcelain stretched too thin, that painted her lips the color of wine she could no longer drink, it was merciful in its certainty. Death, after all, was the only promise kept in a life of broken vows. But the dhampir saw what the priest could not. He stood in shadow, his silhouette neither entirely man nor entirely legend, the son of darkness and mortal woman caught between two eternities. His eyes, amber and ancient, fixed on the barely perceptible rise and fall of her chest. 27 years he had walked this earth, and never had he witnessed such a paradox, a human heart still singing its fragile song while her soul had already begun its descent into silence. "She is gone," Father Dimitri whispered, signing the cross. "God rest her." The dhampir said nothing. In Hungarian, his mother tongue buried beneath decades of wandering, he knew a truth the priest would never comprehend. There were fates worse than death. There were eternities carved from moments of exquisite hesitation, the space between heartbeats where a choice could unmake the world. Katerina had been a violinist once, the kind that made audiences forget to breathe, that turned concert halls into cathedrals of sound. Her fingers had known the language of transcendence, had drawn tears from strings the way poets draw blood from stone. Then came the marriage to Viktor Volkov, the industrialist whose wealth could purchase anything except the loyalty of his wife's soul. Then came the children she would never have. Then came the cough, small and insignificant, that bloomed into an empire of disease. The dhampir had heard her play, 3 months ago, in a garden behind the old palace. She had been alone, violin in trembling hands, playing a composition that had no name, something born from the space between despair and surrender. He had stood beyond the marble columns, listening to a human voice speak in the only language that mattered, the language of beings who knew they were already ghosts. He had not meant to reveal himself, but when she collapsed, when her bow fell silent mid-phrase, when her body crumpled like silk, released from a frame, he had moved. Immortals were not meant to intervene. That was the rule, the sacred boundary between worlds. But he had carried her to the guest house. He had placed her on velvet cushions. He had watched fever consume her like a slow crucifixion. And now, in this moment, with Father Dimitri reciting prayers for the dead and morning light breaking through stained glass, the dhampir understood what was happening. The consumption was not taking her, it was transforming her. The blood inside her vessel was changing, crystallizing, becoming something that neither medicine nor God could cure. She was not dying, she was becoming. "The funeral is tomorrow," the priest said, his voice heavy with ritual. "Her husband has requested a closed ceremony. He is already in mourning clothes." The dhampir's jaw tightened. Viktor Volkov, who had taken her violin and locked it away as punishment for her melancholy. Viktor Volkov, who had forbidden her to perform, to create, to speak in any language but obedience. Viktor Volkov, who had transformed a symphony into a dirge. "I will stay," the dhampir said quietly, "to pray." Father Dimitri nodded, understanding nothing. He left the chamber, his footsteps echoing against stone, carrying with him the incense and the inadequate comfort of ritual. Alone now, the dhampir approached the coffin. His hand trembled as he reached toward her face, the first time his skin would touch hers. She was cold, so impossibly cold, her forehead like porcelain beneath a winter sky. Her lips had already lost their color, her hair spread across the pillow like spilled ink. But her eyes, when they opened, they held the green of forests where no sunlight reached, and in them burned a recognition that transcended memory. She gasped, a sound like a violin string drawn too tight, threatening to snap. "What have you done to me?" she whispered, her voice shattered into consonants. "Saved you," he answered. "Or damned you. I am still learning the difference." She tried to move, but her body was paralyzed between two states of being, human enough to remember what it meant to breathe, immortal enough to understand that breathing would never be the same. The pain of transformation blazed through her veins like liquid fire. "The funeral," she gasped. "Will happen," he said, understanding immediately. "You will be buried, and at midnight you will rise." Her eyes found his, and in that moment, something ancient stirred between them. Not love, not yet, but recognition. Two broken things acknowledging the shape of each other's fractures. "Who are you?" she asked. "Someone who understood your music," he replied. "Someone who heard you asking to be transformed." The coffin lid was closing, the seal was coming. And in the darkness, as wood enveloped her, Katerina Volkova began to understand that her life, her true life, had not ended. It was only now beginning. If you believe mercy can resurrect even the damned, subscribe to Blood and Mercy. Midnight came like a knife drawn slowly across skin. Katerina's eyes opened in absolute darkness, the darkness of the grave, of earth and stone, and the weight of a city above her coffin. She did not scream. The scream had burned away in the transformation, replaced by something deeper. The clarity of a predator waking for the first time, tasting hunger that had no name in the human vocabulary. Her hands pressed against mahogany. The wood splintered. She moved through soil as if it were water, her new body understanding gravity as a suggestion rather than a law. The earth gave way to her passage, and she emerged beneath the chapel, gasping air that tasted of copper and starlight. The dhampir was waiting in the crypt's shadows, his amber eyes reflecting candlelight. "How long?" Her voice was different now, deeper, resonant with harmonics that had never existed in her human throat. 27 years I have walked," he said. "The hunger will pass, or it will not. Some of us learn to live alongside it. Others allow it to consume what remains of their humanity." She looked at her hands, pale, impossibly strong, traced with veins that seemed to contain liquid starlight. "My name. Will I still be Katerina?" "You will be many versions of Katerina," he said. "The woman who loved Chopin, the wife who obeyed, the artist who dreamed of transcendence. And now, the creature who understands that transcendence requires a price in blood." She moved toward the chapel mirror, a terrible impulse, a need to see what she had become. But he stopped her, his hand gentle on her shoulder. "Not yet," he whispered. "First, we hunt." The night streets of Vienna were different now. Before, when she had traveled by carriage in her dying days, the city had been a blur of stone and gas lamps. Now every sound was a symphony, the heartbeat of a sleeping baker 3 houses away, the whispered fears of a woman closing her shutters, the old familiar rhythm of the city's blood flowing through veins of street and sewer and human longing. They moved across rooftops, and she discovered that her body understood flight the way it had once understood music, not intellectually, but as pure instinct, as muscle memory encoded in bone and darkness. The dhampir led her to the outskirts, to the slums where the city kept its refuse and its most vulnerable. "Here," he said, pointing to a warehouse where miners gathered to sell their bodies for warmth. "These are the ones no one misses, the ones already half dead from hunger. You will take what they would lose anyway." She descended into shadow and found a man sleeping, his breathing shallow, his veins carrying blood already poisoned by decades of poverty and despair. And Katerina understood in that moment the peculiar mercy of the immortal curse, that hunger could become a form of grace, that taking life could sometimes be an act of compassion. She drank, and the city sang. When she surfaced, her face was painted in crimson, and the dhampir was watching her with an expression she could not read, something between pride and sorrow, between welcome and warning. "What is your name?" she asked him. "You cannot be only darkness." He was silent for a long moment. "In my mortal life, I was called Mikhael. That was before my mother's blood mixed with my father's curse, before I learned that some sins can only be absolved through endless atonement." "Were you like me?" Katerina asked. "Did someone—" "There was no one," he said quietly. "I was born into this, caught between worlds by accident of birth, accepted by neither. I have spent 27 years learning that solitude is the truest form of immortality." She stepped closer, and the rain began to fall, Vienna's eternal winter rain, cold and cleansing. "You heard my music." "I did." "You could have let me die," Katerina said. "I was already surrendering." "Yes. Why didn't you?" He turned away, his silhouette against the charcoal sky. "Because some music deserves to continue playing. Because some souls are too beautiful to condemn to silence. Because I am tired of being alone." In the distance, church bells began to ring, the bells that would announce her funeral mass in the morning. The city would mourn Katerina Volkova, the tragic violinist whose light had been extinguished by disease. They would place flowers on her grave and forget her within a season. But here, in the rain, with blood still warm on her lips and eternity extending infinitely before her, Katerina Volkova began to understand that death was not an ending. It was a doorway, and on the other side, someone was waiting who had chosen not to walk through it alone. Like if you believe even monsters deserve a second chance. 3 nights after her resurrection, Katerina returned to the palace. The gates were no longer locked to her. The living could not perceive the truly undead, only sense them as a disturbance in the air, a wrongness that made their skin prickle with atavistic fear. She moved through the familiar corridors like a ghost retracing the geography of her own grave, each room a chamber of paralyzed time. The drawing room where Victor had struck her hand for playing without permission. The bedroom where she had counted the hours until she could be alone with her music. The studio where her violin had been locked in a cabinet of mahogany and shame. Her fingers knew the combinations. They always had. She had simply been too obedient to try them before. The violin emerged from darkness like a resurrection. Her instrument, her voice, her soul translated into spruce and maple. She lifted it with hands that now understood the weight of eternity, and the bow, her bow, lost for 3 years, seemed to recognize her skin. The first notes she drew were not music. They were a howl, a lament, a sound that belonged to neither living nor dead, but to the threshold between. The palace shuddered. Paintings rattled in their frames, and downstairs Victor Volkov woke in terror, unable to name the dread that consumed him. Mikhail appeared in the doorway, like smoke becoming flesh. His amber eyes reflected the candlelight as he watched her play. This was the moment he had been waiting for, not the hunt, not the transformation, but this, the return of her voice to the instrument designed to carry it. "The city will hear," he said softly. "Even from here, even through these walls, Vienna will hear what you have become." Katerina did not stop playing. The composition was one she had attempted 1,000 times in her human life, a piece beyond her technical capacity, written by a composer who had understood that some music exists only for those who have suffered enough to earn the right to speak it. "Let them hear," she whispered between phrases. "Let them know that Katerina Volkova did not rest in her grave. Let my playing echo through every concert hall, every church, every street, until they understand that some souls refuse to die quietly." The transformation was complete now, not just in her veins, but in her music. Where once she had played with technical precision, with the restraint of a trained artist, now she played with the savage honesty of someone who had been translated into another language. Every note carried the weight of her suffering and the ecstasy of her liberation. Mikhail moved closer, drawn as all sentient things were drawn to authentic beauty. "You could play like this forever," he said. "Centuries of music, endless nights of transcendence." "I could," Katerina agreed, lowering the violin. "But forever is a long time to play alone." Their eyes met, and something shifted in the space between them. It was not the romantic love of novels written by those who still believed death was finite. It was something deeper and more dangerous, the recognition of two beings who had tasted eternity and found it less terrible with company. "Your husband does not sleep well," Mikhail said. "He senses what inhabits his house." "Good," Katerina replied. "Let him suffer in uncertainty. Let him wonder if the music he hears belongs to his murdered wife or his own guilt." "Murdered?" Mikhail's voice held no judgment, only curiosity. "He locked away my violin 3 years ago," Katerina said quietly. "He locked away my hands, my voice, my reason for existing. He murdered me slowly, night after night, until the consumption only needed to finish what he had already begun." She raised the violin again, but this time she played something else. A lullaby, soft and ancient, in a minor key that spoke of forgiveness that was not quite forgiveness, of mercy that contained the seed of vengeance. "I will not kill him," she said. "That would be too simple. Instead, I will let him know that she still plays, that she plays better now, that his attempt to silence her only refined her voice into something too beautiful to ignore." Mikhail understood. In his 27 years of solitude, he had learned that the most exquisite cruelties were always those rooted in truth. Viktor Volkov would go mad not knowing if what he heard was real or phantom, guilt or ghost. He would age rapidly from the terror of being haunted by the very woman he had tried to destroy through slow surrender. "Come," Mikhail said. "There are concert halls in Prague. There are stages where you could perform, where your music would reach thousands. The living pay to hear beauty from bodies they believe are mortal. Imagine what they would experience if they knew they were listening to the resurrected dead." Katerina set down her violin and looked at him with eyes that had learned to see in absolute darkness. "I want to know who you are," she said. "Not the story you tell yourself, but the truth. The father who made you, the mother who tried to love you, the night you chose to stop being human." He was silent for a long moment. "That story takes more than one night to tell." "Then we have forever," Katerina replied. And in that moment, something crystallized between them. Not love yet, but its possibility. The seed of connection between two beings who had learned that isolation was the only luxury immortals could not afford. Outside, Vienna slept, unaware that its daughter had risen, and that her music would soon reshape the city's relationship with beauty, with loss, with the price of transformation. And now, I invite you to leave a trace of your presence in the comments. Tell us where in the world you're watching from and the exact hour you hear this story. We wish to know how far these immortal confessions travel, and at what moments of the night they find you. The monastery stood on a cliff overlooking the Danube, built in the 14th century by monks who believed that proximity to heaven was measured in altitude. Mikhail had not returned here in 7 years. The memories of stone and prayer, of his mother's screams and his father's ancient voice, lived in him like a virus that never quite died. But Katerina deserved to know. They traveled through the night, moving faster than wind, and arrived as the first light began its hesitant assault on darkness. The monastery doors opened at their approach, not because they were unlocked, but because physical barriers had become merely suggestions to beings whose bodies had learned to exist partially outside the visible world. In the library, beneath carved angels and frescoes painted with saints no one remembered, Mikhail began his confession. "My father was not born a vampire," he said, running his fingers along the spines of books written in dead languages. "He was created by a woman whose name I never learned, in a century where the recording of history was itself a luxury. He said she had been beautiful once, and that beauty had made him vulnerable. So he spent 200 years erasing the capacity for beauty from his soul, replacing it with hunger and the rigid discipline of predation. Katerina listened, her new ears catching the tremor beneath his words, the vibration of a wound that had never healed. "My mother was mortal," Mikhail continued. "A woman who lived in the village below this monastery. She was kind to him when he was weak from hunger, sick from the contradictions of his own nature. She did not know what he was. He allowed her to love him without the truth, and in that mercy, or that cruelty, I was born." He led her to a portrait painted on the highest wall, behind the altar. A woman with dark eyes and hands that seemed to gesture toward transcendence she would never achieve. When my father understood what I was, neither one thing nor another, capable of walking in daylight but forever drawn to darkness, he decided I was an abomination, a mistake that needed correction. Mikhail's voice became flat, empty of emotion. My mother disagreed. She tried to protect me by speaking truth to a being older than most nations. That was her greatest error. The silence that followed held the weight of centuries compressed into a single moment. "What happened?" Katerina asked, though some part of her already knew. The immortals always carried their traumas like stigmata, marked by losses no mortal could comprehend. "He chose to make her death meaningful," Mikhail said. "He did not simply kill her. He transformed her, slowly, letting her experience both the ecstasy and the agony of becoming undead while she begged him to let her return to simple mortality. She cursed him at the end, cursed his immortality, cursed his existence, cursed the hunger that had made him capable of such cruelty. And I stood beside him, not yet understanding that I was choosing sides in a war that would never end." Mikhail walked to a window overlooking the Danube. The river moved like molten silver in the pre-dawn light. After she became something between life and death, neither content nor capable of peace, my father disappeared. He said his work here was finished, that he had demonstrated the futility of combining two natures that were fundamentally opposed. I was left alone in this monastery where the monks knew something had happened but lacked the language to name it. I spent 7 years in prayer, asking God to explain why I had been born at all. "And now?" Katerina asked. "Now I understand that the question itself was the curse," Mikhail replied. "My father wanted me to spend eternity wondering if my existence was an error. Instead, I chose to spend it looking for instances where beauty could justify the suffering that preceded it. I chose to believe that meaning could be created, not inherited. That perhaps having two natures meant I could understand forgiveness in a way the purely immortal or purely mortal never could." Katerina moved beside him, their reflections in the window appearing and disappearing like ghosts, unsure of their own solidity. "Is your mother still alive?" she asked. Mikhail shook his head. Eventually, the weight of her despair became too heavy, even for an immortal body to carry. She walked into sunlight at sunrise and asked me not to stop her. I honored that request, though it cost me a piece of myself that I am still learning to live without. "And your father?" "I have not seen him in 27 years, Mikhail said. "But I feel his presence sometimes, like a shadow that follows me through the centuries. He is still out there, still creating, still trying to prove some theorem about suffering and superiority. And I suspect that one day our paths will cross again, and I will have to choose between the teachings of mercy and the imperatives of blood." Katerina took his hand. It was cold, but no colder than hers, and in that equivalence lay a form of comfort. "When that day comes," she said, "you will not be alone." Something shifted in his face, not quite hope, but its preliminary shadow. "Why did you show me this?" she asked. "Why not let me believe you were simply choosing to spare the lonely?" "Because," Mikhail said quietly, "you deserve to know that I carry my own damnation, that choosing to save you was not pure mercy. It was also selfishness, the desire to not walk through eternity completely alone. It was also fear, the terror that I might become like my father, so dedicated to my own isolation that I forgot how to recognize love when it approached. Outside, the first rays of sunlight began to touch the monastery walls. Mikhail pulled her into the deepest shadows, and as the day began to reassert its dominion over the world, they remained in the darkness together, two beings whose very existence was a question mark, learning that questions, when shared, felt less like riddles and more like the beginning of conversation. If this story has already captured you, leave a like. It helps the voices of those who chose eternity reach more hearts. Prague's Estates Theatre had been built for the living, all velvet and gilded plasterwork, designed to make mortal hearts flutter with the proximity to beauty. On the night of the concert, Mikhail arranged for the theatre to be open to an audience of the undead, vampires, dhampirs, and creatures that had no name in any language, all drawn by rumors of a musician who had played for the dead and chose to play for them still. Katerina stood backstage, her violin resting against her shoulder like a lover's head. The hunger was always present now. A constant companion like breathing had once been, a rhythm she had learned to live within without allowing it to consume her consciousness. The blood she had taken before arriving still sang in her veins, making her fingers nimble and her mind crystalline. "Are you afraid?" Mikhail asked, appearing from the shadows as if he had always been there. "Of playing badly?" "No," Katerina replied. "I could play badly, and it would still move them. Fear requires the possibility of failure, and I am beyond failure now. I am only interested in transcendence." The orchestra began to assemble. Other immortals, musicians who had been transformed over centuries, who had learned to play instruments as mortals learned to breathe. There was a cellist who had been turned in 1876, who had played for audiences across Europe before choosing to hide in darkness. There was a violinist who predated the instrument's invention in its modern form, who had learned to translate emotions that had no names into sounds that required centuries of human suffering to truly comprehend. And there was Mikhail, carrying his father's violin, a Stradivarius from the 16th century, worth more in material value than entire kingdoms had possessed. But that was not why he held it. He held it because his father had made him a gift of it the night before he disappeared, with a note that said only, "Perhaps you will create beauty where I created only hunger." The lights dimmed. The curtain rose. Katerina emerged onto the stage as if floating above it, her body translucent in the theatrical lights. The audience held its collective breath. Even the undead retained this capacity for awe, this animal recognition of something beautiful approaching. She did not bow. Instead, she lifted her violin and began to play. The composition was Mikhail's, one he had written across 2 centuries in fragments, in hotel rooms and monastery cells, in darkened concert halls after the living had gone home to their finite lives. It was a piece that existed partially in silence, in the spaces between notes, in the architecture of what was not said. As Katerina played, the theme evolved. The orchestra joined her, not in harmony but in counterpoint, each instrument a separate consciousness, acknowledging the other's existence without surrendering its own voice. It was the most beautiful sounds Mikhail had ever heard, or perhaps it was the most terrifying. He could no longer distinguish between the two. The piece progressed through 7 movements, each one addressing a different face of immortal suffering. First movement, the ecstasy of first transformation, when pain becomes transcendence, and the limitations of human flesh are finally shed. Second movement, the discovery that freedom without purpose is indistinguishable from slavery. Third movement, the slow realization that beauty fades, that the most moving sunset eventually becomes ordinary, that the human capacity for wonder can be eroded even by eternity. Fourth movement, the encounter with another consciousness that has survived long enough to remember when the world was different, triggering the peculiar intimacy of shared memory. Fifth movement, the question of whether love across the species barrier, between human and immortal, between mortal and undead, was redemption or merely sophisticated self-deception. Sixth movement, the acknowledgement that pain does not diminish with time. It only becomes more familiar, more integrated into the architecture of self. Seventh movement, the tentative hope that meaning could be created from suffering, that beauty born from anguish was the only authentic beauty that existed. As the final notes dissolved into silence, not a single member of the audience moved. The dead, it seemed, had forgotten how to applaud. Instead, they wept, ancient tears from eyes that had learned not to feel centuries ago. In that moment, Katerina understood that she had not merely played music. She had given voice to a grief that had been accumulating across centuries, waiting for someone to translate it into sound. When the applause finally came, it sounded like thunder, like the end of the world, like the beginning of something entirely new. Afterward, in the theater's private chambers, a woman approached them. She was ageless, her beauty so profound that it hurt to look at her directly. Her eyes held the depth of the oldest forests, and when she spoke, her voice carried the weight of decisions made across millennia. "I am Isabeau," she said. "I have walked this earth for 3,000 years, and I have heard perhaps 20 pieces of music that justified existence. This was one of them." Mikhail bowed slightly, his hand instinctively finding Katerina's. "You have created something dangerous," Isabeau continued, addressing Katerina directly. "Art that reminds the undead why we continue walking. Most immortals prefer to forget. Forgetting is simpler than remembering. You have complicated their eternity." "Is that a condemnation?" Katerina asked. "No," Isabeau replied. "It is an invitation. There are others like us, scattered across the world, living in exile from the living world. Many of them have forgotten what it means to feel. Your music remembers for them. If you are willing, I can arrange performances in cities across the continent. You could become the voice of the damned, the translator of our grief." Mikhail and Katerina exchanged a glance. In that glance lived all their fears and all their possibilities. "We will consider it," Mikhail said carefully. "But first, we need to understand what it means to be bound to each other across eternity. We need to learn if love, true love, is possible between two beings who have so much time to grow tired of each other." Isabeau smiled, and in that smile lived centuries of witnessing human hearts trying to fathom eternity. "Then I will wait," she said. "Time, after all, is the only thing the immortal have in abundance. Like if you'd choose eternity for love that sees your soul." Vienna's streets were crystallized in ice the night Mikhail asked Katerina the question that would define her eternity. They stood on the Danube's frozen surface, where the river had become temporarily solid, a phenomenon that occurred perhaps once every 100 years, when winter was cold enough to stop the eternal flow. Around them, the city glowed with distant lights, unaware that its daughter walked upon miracle and ice. "My father has requested a meeting," Mikhail said quietly. "After 27 years of silence, he has sent word. He wishes to meet us." Katerina felt the information settle into her bones. "Why? What does he want?" "I do not know," Mikhail replied, "but I suspect he has heard about you. He has heard that I have not only survived solitude, but have transcended it, that I have not become him, cold, hungry, dedicated to the proposition that suffering is the truest form of existence." "Are you afraid?" Katerina asked. Mikhail was silent for a long moment. The ice beneath them seemed to breathe, expanding and contracting with the stress of supporting weight it was never designed to bear. "Yes," he finally admitted. "I am afraid of becoming him. I am afraid that if I spend enough time with you, I will eventually contaminate your soul with my own despair. I am afraid that love given enough time, will curdle into the same hunger that drives my father. I am afraid that I was arrogant to believe that saving you was anything other than saving myself from complete annihilation." Katerina set down her violin case. She never traveled without it now, never went anywhere without the physical manifestation of her transformed voice. "Let me tell you something I have learned," she said. "In the moments before I died, I was not afraid. I was only sad that my music would die with me. When you showed me the possibility of continuation, I did not hesitate. Not because of you, but because of the violin, because there was still music to play, and I had not yet said everything that needed to be said." She took his hands. They were cold, but not the cold of death, the cold of genuine connection, of two beings choosing to share warmth. "If we meet your father," she continued, "and if we face whatever confrontation waits, we face it as two beings who chose each other. Not because we are terrified of solitude, but because the music is better when played together. Not because we believe love conquers all. I have lived long enough now to know better than such certainties. But because meaning requires witnesses. And I wish to witness your becoming, and I wish to be witnessed in return." Mikhail pulled her close, and in the frozen center of a river that would thaw in spring, two beings who had stepped outside time allowed themselves to exist fully in the present moment. They did not kiss. Immortals rarely did, because kissing belonged to the realm of human passion. And they had learned that passion was a luxury that rarely survived centuries. Instead, they held each other in acknowledgement, in recognition, in the quiet assertion that they had chosen this, each other, the darkness, the endless responsibility of being conscious for longer than any mortal mind was designed to comprehend. "There is something else," Mikhail said. "Isabeau has become more insistent about the performances. She has arranged a concert in London, then Paris, then Berlin. If we accept, we will be visible to every immortal on the continent. We will be known." "Is that bad?" Katerina asked. "It means we cannot hide," Mikhail replied. "It means my father will know exactly where to find us. It means every ancient vampire with a grudge, every creature seeking to control or corrupt us, will come looking for what makes us worth destroying." Katerina stepped back, her eyes reflecting the starlight on ice. In her gaze, Mikhail saw the woman who had played the violin despite Victor's prohibition, despite her body's rebellion, despite death itself. "Then we will play," she said. "Let them come. Let them know that two beings refuse to hide their light. Let them learn that transformation can lead to defiance, not merely survival. Let my music travel through every concert hall in Europe as a warning and an invitation. A warning that we are becoming something new and an invitation to anyone brave enough to listen." The ice groaned beneath them as if responding to her words. In the distance, church bells began to ring, calling the faithful to a midnight service that would include prayers for the souls of the dead. "We will meet him," Mikhail said. "We will go to the place my father chooses, and we will discover what he has learned across the centuries of our separation. But we will go as ourselves, not as supplicants seeking his blessing, but as the architects of our own meaning." Katerina smiled, and in that smile was the echo of every woman who had refused to be silent, every artist who had continued creating despite the world's indifference, every being who had chosen to speak, even knowing that words might be the most dangerous weapons in existence. If this story has already captured you, leave a like. It helps the voices of those who chose eternity reach more hearts. The meeting place was in Prague, in a cathedral that existed partially outside the visible world, a place where the barriers between living and dead had worn thin enough that both could meet without triggering the alarms of natural law. Mikhail's father stood before an altar made of stone that predated Christianity itself. His frame so thin it seemed that wind might scatter him into legend. His eyes were the color of blood that had been diluted to transparency, and when he spoke, his voice carried the weight of languages that had been dead for millennia. Mikhail, he said, and in that single word lived centuries of judgment. You have created exactly what I predicted, a half-breed infatuation with a human turned immortal. You have proven that the mixing of species only produces aesthetic delusion. I have proven, Mikhail replied quietly, that your philosophy was limited by your capacity for joy. You mistook survival for existence, and in doing so, taught yourself that beauty was weakness. Mikhail's father turned his attention to Katerina. His gaze was a physical thing, attempting to peel away her layers, to reduce her to component parts. And you, he said, the violinist. Tell me, does your music originate from authentic feeling or merely from the programming Mikhail has instilled? Are you playing his grief or your own? Katerina lifted her violin without speaking. She began to play, not the composition she had performed in Prague, but something older, something that belonged only to her. It was the sound of Viktor Volkov's hands striking her face. It was the sound of silence demanded by a man who could not bear witness to his wife's joy. It was the sound of breath becoming difficult, of lungs filling with the weight of surrender. And then it transformed. It became the sound of waking in a coffin and understanding that death was not the end. It became the sound of the first hunt, of taking life while giving mercy. It became the sound of a violin lifted after years of imprisonment, of fingers remembering their language even as they learned an entirely new vocabulary. It became the sound of standing beside another being in darkness and choosing to stay. By the time the final notes dissolved into silence, even Mikhail's father had stopped his casual dismissal. His ancient eyes held something that might have been recognition or might have been fear. The immortals often confuse the two. She plays with your melody, he said to Mikhail, but the voice is entirely her own. Yes, Mikhail replied. That is what I have learned, that you never understood. We are not meant to create carbon copies of ourselves. We are meant to find beings whose consciousness complements our own and let them become fully themselves in the presence of that connection. Mikhail's father moved down from the altar, his footsteps echoing through the cathedral like someone walking through their own grave. I came here intending to offer you a choice, he said. I have searched for 300 years to find another being like me, someone born of mixed blood, someone capable of understanding the unique burden of existing between worlds. I found him, and I wanted to bring him to you as a companion, to show you that your solitude was not the only possibility. He gestured, and from the shadows emerged another figure, younger than Mikhail perhaps, but with the same amber eyes, the same struggle of two natures attempting to coexist in a single form. This is Nikolai, Mikhail's father said. He is dhampir, like you. He is lonely, like you. I believed you two might understand each other in ways that the fully immortal and fully mortal could never achieve. Mikhail studied Nikolai carefully. There was no deception in the man's face, only the genuine weariness of one who had walked the earth for more than a century, seeking connection in a world that offered only judgment. Why did you really bring him here? Mikhail asked his father. Not as a companion, but as what? A threat? A replacement? As proof, his father replied, that blood matters, that our kind, the mixed, the between, the neither nor, belong together, that you cannot truly build meaning with a human turned immortal when you share more fundamental nature with this. Katerina stepped forward. He is wrong, she said simply. Blood matters, but not the way he believes. What matters is not what category we fall into, but what we choose to create from our existence. Mikhail chose to save me. I chose to let myself be saved. That choice is more powerful than any of our respective biologies. She turned to Nikolai directly. What do you want? She asked. Nikolai's voice, when it came, was raw with centuries of restraint. I want what he has, he said, nodding toward Mikhail. Someone who sees me, not my biology, not my curse, but my choices. Someone worth staying conscious for. Then find her, Katerina said. Find someone whose music matches yours, whose suffering has been refined into wisdom. But do not accept someone because you share blood. That is only another form of the isolation you wish to escape. Mikhail's father watched this exchange with something approaching wonder on his ancient face. You have both become something I did not predict, he said finally. You have become dangerous in an entirely different way than I anticipated. You do not justify existence through suffering or through superiority. You justify it through creation. He turned to leave, and Mikhail called out one final question. Will you disappear again for another 27 years? His father paused at the threshold between worlds. No, he said. I think I will watch what you create. I think I will discover whether you are correct or whether you are simply deluding yourselves more skillfully than I did. As his father vanished into shadow, Mikhail approached Nikolai. If you wish, he said, you could travel with us. We perform concerts across Europe. You could attend, experience music that is made by the transformed. You could begin to understand what connection looks like when it is not rooted in blood obligation. Nikolai nodded slowly, gratefully, and as the three of them moved toward the cathedral's exit, Katerina began to play softly, not a formal piece, but something like a lullaby, like a welcome, like the first note of a song that had no final resolution, only endless variations. Comment eternal, if you'd survive the night for someone worth dying for. 6 months after the meeting in Prague, the Midnight Symphony performed its first complete concert in Berlin. The theater was filled with a mixture of audiences, the living who had been told the performers were merely exceptional artists, and the dead who came to witness the phenomenon that had been transforming their understanding of eternity. Mikhail sat with the orchestra, his father's violin resting against his shoulder. Nikolai stood with the string section, his instrument speaking in conversation with the others. And Katerina stood in the center, her violin an extension of her transformed soul. The piece they performed that night was something new, a composition that had been written collaboratively across months, with Mikhail providing the mathematical structure, Katerina contributing the emotional architecture, and Nikolai adding the unexpected variations that prevented the composition from becoming too familiar, too predictable. As they played, something shifted in the theater. The barrier between living and dead became transparent. For 2 hours, both audiences experienced the same revelation, that beauty did not end at death, that love did not require a heartbeat to be authentic, that the most profound music came from beings who had learned to love despite, or perhaps because of, the knowledge that their love would never be finite. When the final note dissolved, the living rose to their feet, unclear why they wept, why the music had penetrated so deeply into their souls. The dead remained silent, but their silence was a form of applause, the recognition of peers acknowledging that one of their own had created something worthy of immortal attention. In the intermission, a woman approached Mikhail backstage. She was human, perhaps 30 years old, and her eyes held the peculiar clarity of someone who had glimpsed death and survived. I heard your music, she said, and I understood something I have been running from. I have been ill for 5 years, and I have been afraid of dying. But listening to your composition, I realized that I am not afraid of death itself. I am afraid of my life having been meaningless. If you could make something this beautiful from your suffering, then perhaps my suffering could also create something beautiful, if only in the way that my story ends. Mikhail felt Katerina's presence behind him before she spoke. Then live, Katerina said gently. Live fully, knowing that your existence matters not because you will survive forever, but because the choices you make today will continue echoing into the futures of beings who do survive forever. You are not condemned to insignificance by your mortality. You are blessed with urgency that the immortal have lost. The woman left with tears on her cheeks, and Mikhail turned to find Katerina watching him with the same tenderness she had shown on the frozen Danube. "This is what your father failed to understand," Mikhail said quietly. "This is what he spent centuries searching for, meaning, but he was looking for it in the wrong place. It is not inherited through immortality. It must be created daily, moment by moment, through the choices we make about connection." "We have forever to keep creating it," Katerina replied. After the concert, as Berlin slept beneath a starless sky, they walked through the city together. Mikhail and Katerina, Nikolai following at a respectful distance, understanding that some connections required a particular intimacy, some love stories belonged only to two. In the abandoned concert hall on the outskirts of the city, Mikhail asked the question that had been living beneath every moment they had shared. "I have been afraid," he said, "that my love for you would eventually calcify, that centuries would erode what now feels sacred. I wanted to ask you, are you willing to continue discovering new ways to love each other, even as we discover new ways to be broken, across an eternity?" Katerina lifted her violin and played a single note, long, sustained, resonant. It was the sound of yes, the sound of forever, the sound of a being who had been given the choice between death and continued existence, and had chosen to transform that continuation into music. "I will love you," she said when the note dissolved, "in ways that I cannot yet imagine. I will play music that does not yet exist. I will transform suffering into beauty, not because I believe suffering is beautiful, but because I know that beauty is the highest possible use of suffering." She took his hand. "I will choose you every single night that I wake, for as long as we both exist. Not because I have no other options, but because you remind me that eternal life without meaning is just slow death. You remind me that transformation is possible, that even the damned deserve to hear their own music translated back to them." Mikhail pulled her close, and for the first time, they kissed, not with the passion of the living, but with the profound tenderness of two beings who had learned that forever was only bearable with company. Outside, Nikolai was playing his violin alone in the snow, creating variations on the theme that had defined the evening. And as his music mixed with the silence of the city, both Mikhail and Katerina understood that this was what immortality truly meant. Not the absence of death, but the continuation of creation. Not the escape from suffering, but the transformation of it. They emerged from the concert hall as dawn threatened to break. Katerina led Mikhail to a rooftop overlooking Berlin, where they could watch the sun rise without being exposed to its lethal rays. They would shadow themselves with darkness, standing in the threshold space where day and night intersected. "Your father asked if you would create beauty from suffering," Katerina whispered, as the first rays of light touched the horizon. "Yes," Mikhail replied, "and now I have. Every night we continue, every concert we perform, every moment we choose each other, that is the beauty. That is the meaning." As the sun rose fully over Berlin, casting long shadows across rooftops and streets, they did not retreat into darkness. Instead, they stood at the boundary, fully visible to the new day, and played their violin duet, not for the living, not for the dead, but for themselves. The music spoke of transformation and redemption, of love that had chosen them both. It spoke of suffering that had been translated into transcendence, of beings who had refused to be consumed by eternity. It spoke of the eternal truth, that love is the only force that makes forever bearable. Subscribe if you believe mercy can resurrect even the damned. Like if you'd choose eternity for love that sees your soul. Comment eternal if you'd survive the night for someone worth dying for. And know that somewhere in the darkness, two beings continue playing, continue creating, continue loving across an infinity that they have transformed into meaning. The music never ends. It only learns new ways to speak.